You know, history is packed with powerful leaders, right? But what happens when that power isn't just used for conquest, but for unbelievable cruelty? When leadership completely rots away into pure, unfiltered evil? Well, today we're going to stare into that abyss and look at some of history's most brutal warlords. And that right there is the big question, isn't it? I mean, all conquest involves violence, that's a given. But there's a line. So where does that ruthless ambition we see in so many leaders end, and where does just inhuman cruelty begin? We're going to explore that line by looking at three guys who didn't just cross it, they completely erased it. All right, let's kick things off way back in the ancient world with a ruler from the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Now, the Assyrians already had a reputation for being some of the fiercest warriors around, but our first warlord, Ashurbanipal, he basically took that brutality and turned it into a horrifying work of art. You know, what's so bone-chilling about this quote isn't just the awful imagery, it's where it comes from. This isn't some enemy propaganda trying to make him look bad. Nope, this is from his own palace records. This is how Ashurbanipal wanted to be remembered for his victory over Babylon, by bragging about how he desecrated its people. And this is where you really see his strategy. It wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about full-scale psychological warfare. We're talking about skinning rebel leaders alive in public, carving images of his soldiers murdering pregnant women onto his palace walls, and starving entire cities for years on end. The whole point wasn't just to make people submit. It was to absolutely shatter the will of anyone who might even think about defying him. Okay, now let's take a massive leap forward thousands of years into the 20th century. Here, we're going to see how the reasons for this kind of cruelty can change, from a grand imperial strategy to something much more personal, much more twisted, the grotesque ego and bottomless greed of one man, Jean-Bédel Bokassa. $20 million. Just let that sink in. That's how much Bokassa blew in 1977 to crown himself emperor in a ridiculous ceremony he copied from Napoleon. But what does that number really mean? It was 1/3 of his entire nation's annual budget. An absolutely impoverished nation, mind you, all spent on his little fantasy while his people were starving. And this is where the picture just becomes truly sick. On one side, you have this deluded fantasy, the gold robes, the massive eagle-shaped throne. But on the other side, the brutal reality. He had around 100 schoolchildren massacred because they protested having to buy expensive school uniforms that were sold by a company his wife owned. And then there were the persistent, horrifying rumors that he was a cannibal, keeping human flesh in the palace freezers. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, listen to this. This wasn't some order given from a far-off, comfortable palace. No. Eyewitnesses, actual survivors of the massacre, they claimed that Bokassa himself was right there in the prison, personally beating some of those kids to death with his own cane. This gives you a terrifying look into the mind of a true sadist. So we've seen terror for the sake of empire and terror for the sake of a monstrous ego. But our last guy, Foday Sankoh from Sierra Leone, he shows us terror in its most cynical form, as a business model. For him, cruelty wasn't just a tool for power, it was the engine of his entire bloody enterprise. So to really get a handle on Foday Sankoh, you first have to understand this term, blood diamonds. See, he didn't have a government budget to fund his war. He had diamonds. By taking control of Sierra Leone's rich diamond mines, he could trade these little stones for guns, and that's what fueled an 11-year cycle of absolute horror. And what he created was this absolutely devastating and repeatable loop. It's shockingly simple. First, you seize the diamond mines. Then, you trade those diamonds for weapons. You use those weapons and thousands of kidnapped and drugged child soldiers to terrorize everyone. That terror keeps you in control of the mines. And the final, cynical step? Whenever the world started paying attention, he'd sign a peace deal, use the time to rearm, and then just start the whole cycle over again. It's easy for numbers like these to just wash over you, right? But try to imagine the reality behind them. 50,000 people killed, over 500,000 people forced from their homes. That's like the entire population of a major city. And maybe the worst part, thousands upon thousands of children, an entire generation just stolen, kidnapped, drugged, and turned into weapons. But if there's one thing that just sums up his whole philosophy, it's this single, horrifying command, Operation Pay Yourself. He didn't pay his soldiers with money. He paid them by letting them take whatever and whoever they wanted. He basically made lawlessness and atrocity his official policy. So let's just pull it all together. We've seen three very different but equally terrifying faces of evil. First, there was Ashurbanipal, the ancient tyrant who made terror a tool of the state. Then you have Bokassa, the modern narcissist whose personal sadism drove him to murder children. And finally, Foday Sankoh, the ultimate cynic who turned mutilation and massacre into a business. And all this leaves us with a really unsettling final thought. Both Bokassa and Sankoh died before they could truly face justice for what they did. Bokassa was eventually released from prison, and Sankoh died before his war crimes trial could finish. So you have to wonder, when there's no final trial, no accountability, what kind of legacy does that leave? Does the evil just fade away? Or does that lack of justice leave a wound on history that never ever truly heals?